The survival horror genre thrives in the age of streamers, where often the game itself is not the feature. Rather, we tune in to watch the player's reaction. Of course, when this genre was emerging, there was no Twitch or YouTube, which meant to experience a new game was a rare, exciting thing, at least compared to today. Instead of Googling Zelda 64 or Final Fantasy IV, you just hope to one day see a Nintendo Power or maybe a Game Informer with Link on the cover, which meant a new Zelda would be coming in the near future. Otherwise, you might go to Hollywood Video or Blockbuster and just rent a game that had a cool box, or maybe a sequel that you weren't aware existed. And when you did, because info on new games was so scarce, the other kids in the neighborhood would want to come see. You know, someone would say, "Dude, Jambo's got the new Mortal Kombat on Sega Genesis," and someone else would be like, "Whoa, there's a new Mortal Kombat?" And next thing you'd know, the whole neighborhood would be gathered around the TV with Squeeze-Its and Gushers watching 16-bit fatalities, assuming someone knew how to do one. You can probably tell I'm drawing from experience. This was pretty much my childhood. I had these two friends who were brothers, and the neighborhood gang usually hung out over at their house. Often their cousin would come over. He was the older kid who knew all the tricks and had the cool new stuff. So one day he shows up with this new game, or new to me at least. It's called Resident Evil, and it's like no game I've ever seen before. My mom would not have bought me a game like Resident Evil when I was so young, so I didn't really get to play this series until long after the fact, but nonetheless, I have vivid memories of all the neighborhood kids gathered around in a dark basement to watch this game on a 32-inch tube. The game was petrifying and yet relentlessly captivating to roughly 8-year-old me. Even as a spectator, my curiosity was tightly gripped and cultivated. This game made an experience out of the intimate details, like opening a door. People complain about this game's lagging pace, but it's exactly this tempo that slow cooks the experience into a masterpiece of atmosphere. As you might have noticed, for this video I'm mostly showing the 2002 GameCube remake because it's a near perfect recreation, and it's the version I recommend for anyone looking to give this game a go. In nearly every way, Resident Evil is a far cry from the games I was used to in the 90s. You don't beam around the environment like an acrobat, and you don't shred through enemies by the second. Every enemy poses a real threat, and the ammo you spend to deal with them feels like a hefty tactical expense. Firing a weapon or using a healing herb is a decision. Despite the low-resolution graphics, the detail with which you explore this game is remarkably high, even by today's standards. You often have to investigate the smallest details of an item to decipher its purpose, and then you won't know where to use it without revisiting the nooks and crannies of this Metroidvanian map. A cursory experience with each room is not an option. You're forced to become intimately familiar with each area, and as each room crystallizes in your mental map, complete with risks and tactical tidbits, the result is a powerful sense of substance that brims throughout the entirety of this game's environment, putting quality before quantity. The main character really is the mansion, and it is rich with personality and flavor. Unfortunately, the series really lost these effects over time. As each game tried to out-epic the last, the scale grew larger, and the arsenal became more robust. Environmental intimacy was no longer a priority. The player was less vulnerable to enemies and more poised for fight than flight. Resident Evil eventually crossed more into the action-adventure genre, and there's nothing wrong with that objectively. Franchises obviously evolve, action games have their merits, but I think it's fair to say that during the Xbox 360, PS3 era, Resident Evil games failed utterly to capture the essence of their predecessors, even if they had their own new merits. I think fans were ready to see a return to form. Luckily, we're living in somewhat of a renaissance of survival horror games, with the likes of Outlast, Alien Isolation, the cancelled Silent Hills, and I think even Five Nights at Freddy's did a lot to repopularize horror in games. Best of all, Capcom took note. Resident Evil 7 is not perfect, but it is a return to form. The environmental intimacy is back, and it is genuinely frightening. I think it's easily the scariest of the whole series. The puzzles are a bit shallow in comparison to Resident Evil 1, but if nothing else, it had the right prospect in mind. That slow tempo, the claustrophobic environments, and the attention to detail are resurrected here. Even opening a door in this game is once again intimidating and ominous, probably more so than ever before. This game managed to get a crowd of my friends gathered around the TV again, captivated by that thick suspense, something I hadn't seen in many years. And what followed was the Resident Evil 2 remake. Now this, I believe, is the high point of the series. The atmosphere is rich with trepidation, but like the original, it seems to constantly conjure your curiosity. The general enemies feel intimidating, but manageable by way of those careful tactics. Your resources are limited, so you're constantly poised to think, but it never feels like you're utterly Best of all, puzzles return in their purest form. You'll investigate items and wonder what they're for, and find clues that prompt eureka moments. The scale is fairly modest, but densely packed with substance. Like the original, it rewards your curiosity and patience in the best possible ways. And I have to mention the star of the show, Mr. X. When he enters the picture, the game becomes a heart-pounding exercise of cat and mouse. You more or less have free reign of the map, throughout which you must complete various tasks to make your escape, but all the while you are on the run from this ominous juggernaut who's somewhat of a cross between a T-800 and Frankenstein. Even when he's not in the same room as you, his footsteps can be heard. It's not hard to lose him momentarily, but even then he just patrols like a cold, emotionless machine.
Listen and understand. That Terminator is out there. It can't be bargained with. It can't be reasoned with. It doesn't feel pity or remorse or fear, and it absolutely will not stop. Ever. Until you are dead.
Of course, just recently Resident Evil 3 got a remake. The developers have described it aptly as more of an action-focused experience, and it succeeds at what it aims to be, which means it is somewhat of a departure from the horror template of Resident Evil 1 and 2. Instead of managing small quantities of enemies, the player is positioned to mow down hordes of them. There's much less creeping down dark hallways and more scripted, action-packed chase sequences. It shares its engine, mechanics, and many of its assets with the Resident Evil 2 remake, which occasionally makes it feel like an action game that's reluctantly bound to the horror format of Resident Evil 2. The city looks great. I mean, you put a bunch of neon signage in a wet, dark city and I'm in. So Resident Evil 3 definitely has its aesthetic high points. The puzzles have been scaled back a lot. For example, at no point in my playthrough did I find an item that I didn't instantly know what to do with. And that's okay, because it's a different type of game. Nemesis, who is sort of this game's Mr. X, isn't as creepy in my book. He doesn't have that uncanny valley factor that Mr. X has. That modest attempt to blend in and look human is what skyrockets the creepy factor, whereas Nemesis wears evil on his sleeve. Ultimately, Resident Evil 3 is sort of a middle ground between the horror entries in the series and the more action-heavy ones. It all comes down to taste, so do what you will with that info, but personally, I recommend the Resident Evil 2 remake for anyone looking to experience proper Resident Evil in 2020. I guess the elephant in the room is that there's an inevitable demand for a Resident Evil 4 remake. Thinking about those woods recreated with the fidelity of the new Resident Evil 2, that sounds amazing, but to be perfectly fair, Resident Evil 4 doesn't need it quite as badly. The first 3 games used flat, pre-rendered environments, making them both easier and more essential for the remake treatment, whereas Resident Evil 4 is already fully 3D, and obviously the graphics don't look great today, but it has aged significantly better than, say, Resident Evil 1 on the PS1. Not to mention, RE4's scale is so much larger. It may not be too reasonable to expect the same one-to-one recreation, but don't get me wrong, if they do it, I will buy it, and I will play it. Technically, the Resident Evil 1 remake is older than Resident Evil 4, so it might be time to give that one another rendition. I guess that would make it a re-remake. It sounds ridiculous, but I can't be the only one asking for it, having seen Jill Valentine in her original STARS uniform, newly rendered as an RE3 unlockable. If I were a betting man, I'd say we'll see it happen sooner or later. There's also Code Veronica, and I'm sure that one needs a remake sooner or later, but I can't speak much on that one because I haven't played it. It's on my to-do list. But really, I think I'm more excited for Resident Evil 8, whatever that may be. Rumors are sparse but consistent. Supposedly it's in first person like Resident Evil 7, set in a small village that leads to a castle. Witches and werewolves, or at least creatures reminiscent of them, are said to play a role. With such a vague description, I'd have to see it in order to judge it, but I'm hoping that the series will retain the horror direction of 7 and 2 in a fresh setting and atmosphere, and I get the feeling we'll know more soon. If you enjoyed this content, please consider checking out my other videos. This is a new channel, so your like or sub would go a long way. Thanks for listening, and I hope to see you next time.